And welcome to the Research Works podcast, brought to you in association with Curtin University and the Healthy Strides Foundation. Your hosts are Dr. Dana Poole and Dr. Ashley Thornton, and together we will interview world-leading researchers in the area of child health to support your practice in being more evidence-based. Our guest speaker today is Dr. Sian Williams, a postdoctoral research fellow with the Australasian Cerebral Palsy Clinical Trials Network and Curtin University, who's based in Auckland, New Zealand. Hi, Sian.
Hi,
hello,
thanks
Sian.
for having me.
And hello, Dana.
Hello.
Thank you for coming on. How are you both?
Well, really well. I think it's still summer, so it still kind of feels slightly summery holiday. How about you, Sian? How are you?
Very nice and warm here today. I've been very keen to jump down on the beach this afternoon if I can get down there. Lovely day.
We'll try not to keep you too long there. So I just had a little question to both of you to kind of help our listeners get to know us all a little bit better.
I like these.
And my question for this week is, if you could have a superpower, any superpower, Dana, what would it be?
For me, that is hands down definitely to be able to fly. I literally have dreams where I feel like I'm flying. So I think there's something about that. I just love the idea that I can fly from one place to another, no traffic. I could head over to the other side of the world and I could be really, really, really happy. I don't know, what would your superpower be?
I think, very selfishly, mine would be to be able to be invisible whenever I wanted. Because I just think about all the concerts you could sneak into and all the fun things you could do without paying for them. All the conversations you could listen to.
Okay, so let's get down to the real reason. I want to know what they're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. What about you, Sian?
I would love to be able to teleport. And so kind of the same as Dana, I'd be able to just go, look, I need to be at work in 5 minutes. I'm there. Or, hey, I want to go visit my family and not have to go through quarantine. I'm there. I don't have to travel for X amount of hours to get anywhere. I can skip everything and see everyone and do everything much more efficiently. And I hate traffic, so it would just be perfect. That's my hope.
That's a good one. That's a really good one.
Yeah.
We all have really good reasons for our superpowers. I like it.
We're going to talk about another one of Sian's superpowers a little bit later.
Oh, yes.
But for everyone listening, we're going to review an article that was published in 2020 in Developmental Medicine and Child Neurology. And Sian was the lead author of that paper, which was titled Measuring Skeletal Muscle Morphology and Architecture with Imaging Modalities in Children with Cerebral Palsy, a Scoping Review. And as you all know, our guest today is Dr. Sian Williams, whose ongoing work in understanding muscle physiology stems from her PhD, in which she used a multidimensional approach to the assessment of a combination of two common therapeutic interventions for children with cerebral palsy. Sian's incredibly skilled in assessments of muscle morphology, and she's using MRI, muscle strength, 3D gait analysis, functional ability, as well as measures of activity, participation, and quality of life. Sian's presented her work all over the world, and when it comes to understanding the muscles of children with cerebral palsy, Sian has shown herself to be quite the expert. The article that we're talking about today forms a significant step in understanding how we measure muscle morphology, which ultimately impacts the treatments that optimize muscle health across the lifespan. And coming back to that second superpower of Sian's that I was talking about, Sian was actually the first swimmer to win the Port to Pub Rottnest Swim back in 2016. And what is this, for those of you who might not be familiar? It's a 20-kilometre solo swim in open water. So from mainland Perth over to Rottnest, which is a small island off Western Australia. She did it in 4 hours and 57 minutes, which was 18 minutes ahead of the first male finisher. And in the news article, she's quoted to have said, I only seriously started training 6 weeks ago. So just for context, I think that swim would probably take me about 5 weeks. And you did it in 5 hours? That's phenomenal.
Open water. I do need to say open water. It's really deep. There's lots of things around. Sian,
What's your secret?
It's just extra motivation to get over to the other side quicker. And for those that haven't been to Rottnest Island, you want all the motivation you can to get there quicker because it's such an amazing place. And yeah, I had lots of thinking time whilst I was swimming, but it was all about getting to the other side as quickly as I can to enjoy the beautiful Rottnest Island.
Well, that is actually so incredible. And I think that really clearly is the segue into this topic. The fact that you could do that training in that period of time tells me you definitely know a thing or two about muscles, how to get the most out of them, and how that influences your activity and participation. I think I did a great job with that segue.
You did. Spot on.
So let's get into the details of this paper. So as usual, I'll go through the PICO format of this scoping review. So the population was children and adolescents with cerebral palsy who had gone assessments for the ultrasound, either 2D or 3D or MRI, to measure at least one muscle parameter, that being morphological and architectural properties of lower limb skeletal muscle in children with cerebral palsy. Now, within this scoping review, what they did was they did systematic searches through the main databases to include Medline, Embase, Scopus, Web of Science, PubMed, and PsycInfo for any articles published up to January 2019. With regards to the outcomes, they found that there was a various study designs employing different methodologies and preferences to investigate isolated muscle. And they found that this may have a tendency to oversimplify the complexity of muscle in individuals with cerebral palsy. What this paper provides, though, is a foundation of understanding changes in muscle parameters, and in particular, the relationship between muscle morphological and architectural features and the ICF. So I think this is a great article for clinicians who are providing interventions that aim to improve muscle. I think it's a great paper that looks at the bridge of science and clinical practice.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So before we get started with the deep dive into muscle morphology and architecture, Sian, could you just explain to our listeners what a scoping review is? Because I think a lot of people will be familiar with systematic reviews and what they do and how they work, but how does a scoping review differ, and why is that something that you chose to use? Why is that methodology something you chose to use for this paper?
Yeah, so a scoping review is similar to a systematic review, and as Dana said before, we still follow that same process of a systematic approach to screening a number of different databases, and we're following proper protocols of reviewing and screening. But a scoping review allows you to be a bit broader. You have a larger and more diverse body of literature that you're able to look at. So you're not just limited to one particular study design. So whereas a systematic review might be really honing in on one specific research question, they might only be looking at randomized controlled trials. A scoping review allows a little bit more other literature to be searched. It also means that sometimes you don't get as high quality literature coming through, and generally you won't see, or traditionally in scoping reviews, you won't see any methodological assessments or risk of bias assessments being done like you would in those systematic reviews. So it does have a potential risk, but we did actually decide we felt it was important to include some sort of an assessment of the quality of our studies, and we have provided that within our scoping review. But that is quite challenging to do because normally those tools are for a specific study design. So to cover the amount of different study designs we had to come up with a different approach. But it was important because it did tie into our question about looking about what has been measured so far and how are things being measured. And so much of that comes down to or relates to the quality of the paper in the end as well. So that's sort of the main differences. It's that it's a broader scope with a scoping review rather than such a specific question. And it's really talking about what has generally been done on a larger topic rather than one specific question that's collating all of the specific data on that one topic.
Yeah, it's like a description of the state of the evidence in a broad area at the time.
Yeah, and I think it's possibly in the past wasn't viewed as to be so rigorous and maybe not rated as highly as, or definitely not as a systematic review, but I think it's gaining a lot more acknowledgement within the literature as being a really valid way to as you said, assess the current state of knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely, and highlight where the gaps are, I suppose.
For sure, yeah.
It is such a huge amount of work. When you go through this this paper, it's incredible, all the articles that you did review. And look, I really want to go into some of the details with regards to some of the things that you did find. And I want to explore that a little bit, because I think as a clinician, someone who might be working on the ground, providing treatments or therapies, I think sometimes we can often glance over and kind of go, I don't really need to know that the features of muscle. But yet what we aim to do in a lot of the work that we do in therapy is to improve muscle health. So first of all, before we go into muscle health, let's talk a little bit about what you use to assess and what ultrasound does and what you actually see with ultrasound. Can you just describe that a little bit?
So I think a lot of people will be familiar with an ultrasound, but I think how that applies to muscle, we've sort of categorized it as two-dimensional ultrasound, which is the normal ultrasound. And then we've also talked about three-dimensional ultrasound. So 2D ultrasound lets you usually measure variables like we can measure muscle thickness, we can measure muscle length perhaps, we can use it to look at right down at the fascicle length and fascicle angles. And that's just a way of positioning the probe on the muscle to be able to look at those different variables. If we add in a 3D camera setup as well, so optoreflective cameras to that ultrasound probe, and I make it sound very simple, but there's a lot more behind the scenes technical work to getting that system set up. You're actually able to obviously still measure the same variables that you would with 2D ultrasound, but now you can actually position those almost, I like to describe it like pieces of bread. You can actually take slices of the muscle, so like slices of bread across all the way down the length of the muscle, and then the 3D setup allows you to put those pieces of bread back together, so you're actually able to get muscle volume.
Wow.
So the 3D ultrasound setup, as opposed to just normal ultrasound, allows you to measure muscle volume and by using anatomical cross-sectional area and piecing that together. Now, MRI is also a similar sort of thing. It's the same thing. You're taking lots of slices along the muscle and you're piecing them back together. And so there are 3 sort of different tools that we've included within this review. And that's the most commonly used when we're looking at imaging muscle.
Yeah, so like in terms of measuring muscle itself, you know, we're so used to looking at muscle strength as what we can sort of measure on the outside. And when you're looking more closely into the detail of the muscle, we're talking a lot about the size. Now, let's explore that a little bit. Why is muscle size so important? And why are we looking at that? Why is volume something that we talk about?
I think if anyone thinks about that moment when they were little, or that they know someone that broke their arm and they've gone into a cast, and 6 or 7 weeks they bring their arm out of a cast and it's this shriveled up looking little arm. And that is, we're all very familiar with this. Or we might be familiar with how our bodies might be looking after a Christmas break, or not exercising for a while. Our muscle size relates to how our muscle can function and how much strength we can output from that muscle. So we already have this intuitive link between muscle size. So the bigger the muscle, the stronger the muscle, right? Mm-hmm. In cerebral palsy, we know that there are smaller muscles, and we also know that there are weaker muscles as well. So we know that link intuitively. And these imaging techniques such as MRI and that 3D ultrasound can allow us to get that picture of how big a muscle is. And so by measuring the size and also even the shape and the length of the muscle too. So we link those to how the muscle functions and how much strength it can output.
So when we're looking at the muscle, so we talk about the volume and how that relates to it. Now, I just want to talk a little bit more into, you've mentioned some other sort of terms there in terms of even just fascicle and pannation angles. You hear a lot of this, and when you read your paper, you do go through that in a fair bit of detail of what you found. So I thought, well, let's go through each of them and talk about what it is and what that actually means for us. So first up, we've gone through muscle volume. So let's go to muscle thickness, which I know you can measure through 2D ultrasound. Well, you can do it through all the techniques. What is muscle thickness and why is that important?
Well, Well, muscle thickness is probably one of the earliest kind of approaches to looking at muscle. It is fairly simple to measure. It's really literally just measuring the distance between, let's just say, the most superficial part and the deepest part of the muscle. So when you put an ultrasound probe, you can see the top and you can see the bottom, or the front and the back, if you want to look at it that way, of a muscle. Or for those fancy people, the aponeurosis of the muscle. And so if the muscle is relaxed, we can see that, we can measure that distance between the two, and we can see that distance, and that's our muscle thickness. If they're contracted, that muscle thickness usually increases. So we can actually see, we can even measure change in muscle thickness just from a relaxed muscle to a contracted muscle.
So that's really interesting. So just to go back into that then. So when you're saying when you can move from different positions, you can see the thickness alter.
Yes.
So what does that, you can see that in real time as well. That's the benefit of using ultrasound, isn't it? You can move the limb and you can see what's actually happening right there and then.
Yeah, it's a benefit and a curse. I think if you're looking to compare between people and compare between groups and even compare between Dana versus Dana in 2 weeks' time, you've got to make sure that that muscle is in the same kind of state as well.
Sure.
So it is really great that you can look at that change. And a muscle's thickness will, the general idea that a muscle thickness will get bigger with when it's stronger. It is that sort of really nice, easy surrogate measure for muscle strength. But there are these caveats of that's again how we just need to be really careful with how we measure muscle thickness. So when we're comparing.
Sure. Okay. Muscle thickness. Ash, what do you reckon? We're clear on muscle thickness?
I think so.
Yep,
I think
I
we
like
can put
that
a tick
one.
next to that one.
And tick. Next one, fascicle length. Let's tell us a little bit about what fascicle length is.
So fascicle length will take you a little bit deeper into the muscle. Again, we're still using, we can still use ultrasound for this one. We're looking at, when you look down at your image of the that you get through the ultrasound, you can see these kind of little stripy lines, and they're the fascicles. And we look at the distance. We can actually measure the distance of that fascicle between, again, within the muscle. We see how long that is. The idea isn't quite as simple as muscle thickness, that a long fascicle length means a strong muscle. And I don't want to scare off all your listeners too much, but it's a bit of a link between our how big the pennation angle is as well, which I know I'm jumping ahead to another variable.
That's okay.
And it really delves into this difference of a force-velocity relationship. So I'd love it to be as simple as, hey, our goal is to get a really long fascicle length of a muscle, but that doesn't necessarily give you a strong muscle. Generally, we do want to have, as a child will grow, for example, we will see that fascicle length tend to get bigger as the muscle itself is getting bigger, but it doesn't continue on and on and on. And at some point, it almost comes to a detriment, or with how fast a muscle can contract as well. So when we're looking at muscle strength, it's not just how much strength can be produced, it's also how fast the muscle can contract to produce that force. And so that's
related to the length tension relationship. Would that be sort of how you'd relate it?
Yeah. And that kind of brings you back down to the pennation angle as well. If the pennation angle is basically the angle of that fascicle length. So if it's on a 90-degree angle, you can almost picture in your mind that the fascicle length is possibly going to be quite small. It's got a shorter distance to travel to the other side. Where if it's a smaller angle, you can almost imagine that angle of that fascicle length being quite long and reaching out to the other side. So those two variables it's not quite as simple as bigger means better, not like our muscle volume and muscle thickness, where we're talking about bigger means stronger. Not necessarily the case there.
Because it has to be relative to function as well, doesn't it? Like different muscles have different functions and actions that they need to perform. So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Absolutely. And that's where, if you're really interested in muscle, you look at the different types. So not all skeletal muscles are physiologically developed the same way, because they need different functions. And so you will have a muscle that has to have more pennation, on some are not even structured that way. So it really does depend on the function itself. So I've sort of jumped you ahead to pennation angle, but I really see them coming hand in hand, those two.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the last one, I guess it relates to some of the terminology before we get into, why this all matters in cerebral palsy, is the anatomical cross-sectional area. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so remember those slices of bread I was talking about? It's like a snapshot. If you cut I don't want to be too graphic, but if you cut that piece of bread, loaf of bread in half, and you showed me what you had as a result, that's that surface area. That's basically what we're looking at, is that whole surface area. That's the anatomical cross-sectional area of a muscle. And again, that is one where we tend to say that's a pretty good surrogate for our idea of strength. Because it's, generally the bigger the muscle, the stronger. But again, same with some of our other measures. Let's say if you measured a muscle right up the top where it's really close, for example, to the hip, that particular muscle might be at its biggest right down more closer to the knee. So if you're thinking, I'm going to take this anatomical cross-sectional area from the same spot for every muscle, you're going to be in a little bit of trouble there, because the muscle does change shape throughout the length of the muscle itself. So we've just got to be mindful that it's almost like a snapshot when we take anatomical cross-sectional area. Whereas the muscle volume gives you, it allows you to piece all of those that together for you to get a better picture of the whole muscle, not just that one snapshot.
Fantastic. That's such a beautiful explanation of each of those different terminologies, and I think just highlights the fact that you are such an expert in this area.
You really are. Thank you, Sian.
So Sian, you've explained the measurement of muscle and how we might do that. For clinicians who might be reading papers where people have measured muscle morphology and architecture, what kinds of things should they be mindful of when they're interpreting the results of the paper? And you kind of touched on that a bit with, making sure with your muscle thickness that, the muscle is in the same position if you're tracking it over time. But what other kinds of things should they be looking out for?
Yeah, and that's partly what this review had found, is that so many people use different approaches, and especially those variables like when we're talking about fascicle length and pronation angle, they're so dependent on the positioning of that particular muscles. So you imagine if your foot is pointed in the plantar flexion versus if you put your foot's up in peak dorsiflexion, all of those variables are pretty much going to change depending on how you've positioned your person that you're investigating them. Throw into that as well with cerebral palsy is that, let's even say we're going to measure everyone. Let's make an even playing field. I'm going to measure everyone's leg at 90 degrees, whatever. But you can imagine, we know that there's variations within children with cerebral palsy, that someone's 90 degrees may not mean that they're actually in a relaxed state.
Yeah,
so
right.
It's much more complicated, and it makes it really challenging for researchers who are so stringent on making sure we've covered all of our variables and just, coming at it as a really standardized, even approach. But even in our standardized approach makes it actually unstandardized between participants. So it's a real challenge.
It does speak a lot to the heterogeneity. I mean, that's what we keep talking about. Yeah. And every time we talk about research, it just comes up even more. Cerebral palsy is a very heterogeneous population. Everyone presents differently. And despite all these challenges, we still persist to want to know more about muscle. And the reason for that in people with cerebral palsy is we know that muscle and muscle health are just really important factors, aren't they?
Absolutely.
So I think when we talk about why we measure this and what we're trying to understand, Sian, can you talk a little bit about why muscle's important with regards to the topic of muscle health?
I think, as I said before, when we have that idea that a bigger, healthier muscle, that it isn't just about the size, it's how well the muscle fires and contracts at the right time and in relation to one another. That idea of having a healthy, functioning muscle really does relate can relate so strongly to how that person can use their muscle in day-to-day life. And I think as researchers, we get so focus down on one variable that we're looking at, and I think we just really need to take a few step backs and go back and go, well, what does this variable actually mean? Is it I'm so focused in on getting a big muscle, but how does that relate to the individual? And that's, again, why we sort of looked into our other measures and who is looking into how that might relate to other variables that are so important to cerebral palsy. A lot of the research looks into how that links with spasticity, for example, and even range of motion, but they're still looking at sort of an impairment focus. We're not still really thinking what's important for the child. Do they want to look really big like Arnold Schwarzenegger? Is that what they're looking for? Or is it, hey, they want to be able to have enough muscle strength and their muscles firing at the right time for them to be able to kick the footy around in the backyard? So it's really coming back to what's important for the person.
Yeah. So would it be fair to say that that was, one of the biggest gaps that you found in this review?
Yeah, and we actually measured or we reported all of the different variables that were studied in all of the different studies, and we categorized them by ICF domain. I mean, the obvious approach is to look at that in relation to impairment focus.
Of course.
But, we really didn't see, we saw some in activity related, some were linked to activity, but really very few were including participation measures. I understand, look, I'm a researcher. I understand when you get a person in to study, you do not have them for weeks and weeks and weeks. You've really got to focus in, and you can usually only, really minimize the amount of time you have with them and make sure you limit the measures you use. But that was something that was really quite obvious, was a very lack of the inclusion of participation, whether it be how muscle relates to participation. There's very, very little linking that.
Yeah. And I think that's a really interesting trade-off, particularly in pediatric research, is the burden of involvement in the research study, whereas looking, that trade-off versus the information that you need to be able to answer your question versus the information that is actually important to the participants and the people who are involved in your research. So it's about finding that balance.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I like how when we're talking about there's this shift towards thinking about participation, it goes across everything really. It's about what's the most important thing. And so what I really like is when we're looking at muscle, but we're looking at something that's not just body structure and function. We're really trying to link everything to participation. It comes down to the whole theme of being very individualized, being very goal focused. Those things are absolutely essential. And a lot of the papers I've been reading lately about muscle and the curves and understanding the relationship, it tells me when I should be aiming my therapy. And I think at the end of the day, that's what I draw from it. Yeah. I know some of the work that Adam Shortland's done, as well as some of the work that they've put out with the Hanna curves of the GMFCS. We know they start to decline between 7 to 9 years of age. What's actually happening to the muscle, and can we identify that? Can we measure changes? What's the effect of our intervention? So Sian, can we just talk a little bit with regards to how we can train muscle and some things that we should be really targeting at specific points in time? I guess it's quite an extension from the work you've done here, but ultimately that's sort of where we're headed.
Yeah, I mean, a portion of the studies that we looked at were intervention focused. So it was really interesting for me and really hard for me not to look at all the details of them. I mean, that were beyond the scope of the scoping review. A lot of, well, not a lot actually, really, but there was the majority of the intervention studies were looking at strength training and the outcomes following strength training, outcomes following botulinum neurotoxin type A, and also, and some of your own work, Dana, following neuromuscular electrical stimulation. And there were then a number of other, different strategies like gait training or aquatic training or even balance training. So there was a few different interventions out there that did look at changes in muscle following those different approaches to intervention, but still really not a big body of work. It's growing, but it's not much for us to really hone in on. I do definitely think strength training and something like combining strength training with a neuromuscular approach, that we're making sure we're activating the muscle before jumping in and loading the muscle up. I think that's so, so key. You just think if you're trying to train up a muscle and it's actually not firing the right muscles, the other muscles around it, around that joint, are working harder than the one that you're actually trying to target.
Yes.
You can imagine you put in 12 weeks, 3 times a week, X amount of load, you get to the end of that 12 weeks and you've strengthened all the other friendly muscles around it, but you haven't targeted the one that you're actually trying to get at. So I think that's an idea of really making sure you take your approach and start really from that physiological level of making sure the muscle is being activated in the right way at the right time or at a suitable time, then starting to strength train and then moving that right through to function and participation. We really need to take it right across the spectrum of how we take our approach for improving muscle. The other thing as well, don't just focus in on one muscle. I know I was just talking about how we need to make sure that muscle is activated, but oh my goodness, what situation does one muscle do all the work?
That's right.
Muscles very rarely work in isolation. So if we just target one muscle and sometimes even just one muscle group, it's potentially not going to have that crossover effect to function. So I think it's really important as clinicians, you need to really think about what group of muscles are important and how does that relate to that child's goal, and then really then go back to the science with what approaches we can use. And even since I've submitted this scoping review, there's been far more papers that have come out. Thank God I got it before they all came out, because I would have had to do the whole search again. There's so many more amazing papers that have come out now that are really getting right into the thick of this area.
Yeah, that's so exciting. And so based on everything that you learned as part of this review, and obviously, taking into account all of the work that's come out after you managed to get the review published, what would you recommend in terms of directions for future research? So not just topics, but maybe methodologies that people might be able to use to try and tease out some of those next questions.
I would love, and I know this is really challenging, but more longitudinal work. There was one study basically that had a longitudinal approach and the rest of them were cross-sectional. And that just really doesn't, look, we've got so much knowledge now, but that doesn't give us a long-term look at this lifelong disability. We need to try to look at long-term studies, looking at long-term effects of interventions in particular. I think that would be really great. I also know that, it's a little bit unfair of me to say it because we did target, children and adolescents within this study. But I do happen to know that there's very little research done in adults at all, let alone in muscle. And also right down to the younger groups as well. There wasn't too many studies were looking under the age of 4. And then I could keep going on, but the one last thing I do want to sneak in there is that there wasn't much really in higher GMFCS levels. So our level 3s, but mainly our level 4s and 5s, there's really very little studies that were able to include them. And that's like, why not? Muscle health is still so important. Yes, absolutely. I know the goal might not be to run and jump around, but you still need muscles and you still need that muscle health. That's so important for their function and their long-term independence as well. So really looking at that different spectrum, a broader spectrum of cerebral palsy too would be what I would hope for.
Yeah, I think we all do. It's such a common gap, isn't it?
It is. We've spoken about it a fair bit. And I would say, Sian, just one last thing to sort of tie that all together as well, because when you said it earlier, I was like, oh, that gets me excited. What you're saying about, you can't just activate the one muscle, whatever it might be, it just really highlights the need to be task specific. We spoke with Professor Anna Novak a few weeks ago, and that's what we were talking about. It needs to be task specific, goal oriented, and it should be the child doing the work, not the therapist doing the work necessarily, not only from a neuroplasticity perspective, but if they're doing task specific work, they're doing task specific strengthening in that position, which is synergistic work. And, I think a lot of what you've said there, I don't know, just gets me really excited. Yeah. And it all links.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we are about to head into our next segment, which is called the Tell It to Ed. Now, the Tell It to Ed segment is a 60-second pitch to the common man Ed. In this segment, Sian, we would like you to be able to describe to Ed, who's got no background in child health and research, about what your study, what your paper was about, and what it actually means for anyone out there who might not be in research or clinicians themselves. So, Ed, are you there?
I am.
Welcome, Ed.
Welcome.
Thanks for having me on the show.
All right, Sian, are you ready?
Yep.
Okay, off you go.
Oh, so cerebral palsy is caused by an injury to the developing brain. So this can happen whilst the baby is still right in mum's tummy, right up until the first 2 years of life. So there's actually quite a few different possible causes of the brain injury itself and how severe the injury is and where the location of the injury is. And that's why that picture of cerebral palsy has such a spectrum of how severe it might affect the person. Now, this injury to the brain leads to changes in how a person is able to move and then also use their muscles, and possibly also causes changes to the muscle itself. So over the last 20 years, researchers have been using different imaging techniques such as ultrasound and MRI to be able to help build our understanding of the muscle in people with cerebral palsy. Often they're comparing to typically developing groups or even between different legs and different severity levels. But mainly a lot of them have been looking at changes in the muscle following interventions, usually with the hope to find better ways to be able to improve our muscle and our movement. So this review has gathered all of the work that's been done in the past looking at legs in people with cerebral palsy between the ages of 0 to 18. And we found that much of what we currently know is coming from quite a few select targeted muscles, mainly those muscles within the calf. And usually we also, a lot of the work is done on higher functioning children. So these are the kids that have less challenges with their movement. There are also a lot of differences with how the muscle itself is being measured. So it's really important we think about how the way that muscle is being measured might actually be changing or almost focusing our understanding of the muscle itself. And it might also change how we can then compare the findings of each of these studies. So, for example, comparing interventions, are we really comparing the outcomes of apples versus apples, or is it apples versus oranges?
That is a great summary, Sian.
Nailed it.
Yes.
Wow.
All right, Ed, do you have any questions for the doctor?
Oh, I think I actually
doctor.
have quite a lot of questions. I'm not sure that we have the time to go through all of that. But I guess, I know nothing about the human body. I've never done a human biology class, and sitting in on these topics has been fantastic for me. So I'm learning a lot. Literally the only thing I know about muscles is watching Mr. Universe, like Arnold Schwarzenegger kind of competitions. So I thought I knew something about the human body and muscles, but I clearly know nothing. But I guess I have one question, and that question would be in relation to muscle health. You touched on it briefly, and maybe I missed it, but what makes a muscle healthy versus not healthy or not at its optimum, or what does that involve? Or how do you define a healthy muscle?
It's really broad, but in a simple way to sort of explain it is, just as you were saying, if you're looking at that Mr. Universe competition and you've got a really big, bulky person going up against a scrawnier looking person, who are you going to put your money on? Who's going to win? And yes, I know it's not about winning, and great for all of them for participating, but you've kind of already got this picture in your mind. We're looking at this big muscle, sometimes a little bit too big, but also in those cases, but you're looking at this big, healthy, juicy looking muscle. You're also thinking if we could use our X-ray vision, or probably MRI vision is better suited, sorry, nerd pun type thing, but there.
Gold standard.
That's okay.
We would actually be looking right down into the muscle to see how healthy it looks as well. So a nice, healthy muscle looks a bit darker, whereas a muscle that might not have so much health to it, might have a little bit of fattiness to it, might not be able to function as well. It might look like a bit like a Wagyu beef piece of steak. So healthy muscle isn't just about the size of the muscle. It's also about the quality of the muscle and how well it works when we want it to work.
All right. Nice. I think I just learned something.
That was great. That was a great explanation, Sian. Thank you so much.
Might be having your steak might be looking at that a bit differently next time.
Definitely.
Well, to everyone who has been listening, as usual, the run sheet notes will be available on our website, which is researchworks.net. And if you want to have this recorded as part of your CPD as well, there's a form that you can fill out that you can also have some reflection notes so that you can have this as part of your PD record.
Next week, we'll be reviewing an article recently published in BMC Pediatrics in 2018 titled A Realist Evaluation of a Physical Activity Participation Intervention for Children and Youth with Disabilities. what works, for whom, in what circumstances, and how. We'll be speaking with the lead author, Dr. Claire Willis, a lecturer and accredited exercise physiologist in the School of Allied Health, Human Services and Sport at La Trobe University. Claire's research focuses on developing and evaluating exercise and physical activity interventions for children and young people with chronic and complex conditions. And we can't wait to talk to Claire.
It's going to be another good one.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time today, Sian. I feel like I've learned a lot.
So much, yep.
And we really appreciate your time and your wisdom. So thank you
for having me, guys. It's been a great chance to have a chat about something that took a long time to do, and it was very interesting. It was a great learning experience for me, so I'm happy to share it with others.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you so much. And thanks to all our listeners. Talk to you guys next time. Bye.
Bye.